Stellantis shares falling after the CEO, Carlos Tavares, resigned abruptly in fill a bow.
The CEO, Carlos Tavares, announcing that he's stepping down. This move follows a strained relationship with the UAW.
That Carlos Tavares and the Stellantis board were not on the same page.
The announcement by Stellantis CEO Carlos Tavares that the company is facing significant financial troubles and is preparing to shut down its U.S. factories marks a seismic moment in the global automotive industry. It also represents a dramatic pivot in international business strategy driven by the newly introduced trade policies of U.S. President Donald Trump. The tariffs imposed on key trade partners have sent shockwaves through global commerce, and companies like Stellantis, which rely on a complex transnational supply chain, are among the first to feel the full force of this economic shift. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Stellantis, formed through the merger of Fiat Chrysler Automobiles and PSA Group, is one of the world's largest automotive manufacturers. It has long maintained a strong industrial footprint in the United States, employing tens of thousands of workers and running multiple production plants that supply not only the domestic market, but also export vehicles and components around the world. The decision to shutter these factories is not only a logistical and financial pivot, but a deeply symbolic one. It reflects a broader unraveling of the post-globalization consensus that had shaped multinational business for decades. The context behind this abrupt move lies in the sweeping tariffs introduced by President Trump shortly after taking office. Framed as a strategy to revitalize American manufacturing and reduce trade imbalances, the tariffs targeted a broad spectrum of U.S. trade partners, including the European Union, Canada, Mexico, and China. While the political rhetoric centered around protecting domestic industries, the actual economic mechanics created an inverse effect for companies whose operations spanned multiple countries. For Stellantis, which operates with a finely tuned balance of manufacturing, parts procurement, and international logistics, the new trade rules rendered its U.S.-based operations financially unsustainable almost overnight. The structure of Stellantis' production model had long depended on importing parts from a variety of countries: engines from Italy, transmissions from France, electronics from Asia, and raw materials from Canada and Mexico. The introduction of tariffs added substantial costs to each of these links in the chain. Where once the United States was a hub of relatively efficient vehicle production, it suddenly became a prohibitively expensive locale to build and export vehicles from. These cost increases weren't marginal. They were crippling, cutting into already thin automotive profit margins and threatening the viability of entire production lines. As Tavares unveiled the plan to wind down U.S. manufacturing, the broader implications for the automotive sector began to crystallize. Beyond the immediate loss of thousands of jobs and the economic impact on local communities dependent on Stellantis plants, the shift signaled a deeper withdrawal of multinational confidence in the U.S. as a reliable base of operations. Other companies will almost certainly view this development as a precedent, not an outlier. If a company of Stellantis' scale and integration can no longer justify its U.S. presence under the new trade framework, smaller or more vulnerable automakers will likely follow suit. The domestic impact is enormous. Regions in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, which had long relied on the automotive sector for employment and local revenue, now face the specter of economic contraction. These are areas that were already vulnerable, often having experienced decades of industrial decline before a modest rebound in recent years. The Stellantis closures may not just reverse that recovery, it could usher in a new era of deindustrialization in areas that were only just beginning to heal from past economic wounds. Workers, unions, and regional officials are left scrambling. Without the power to reverse federal trade policy, local governments have few tools at their disposal to counteract these closures. Retraining programs and economic diversification efforts, while commendable, cannot easily replace the high-wage, high-benefit jobs traditionally provided by the automotive industry. The departure of a major manufacturer also has ripple effects across entire supply chains. Logistics companies, parts suppliers, maintenance firms, and even local retailers all feel the impact when a major industrial player pulls out. Internationally, the implications are equally profound. For Stellantis, the shift represents a strategic recalibration toward markets that are either less exposed to U.S. tariffs or offer more favorable trade environments. European factories in countries like France, Germany, and Italy are poised to absorb much of the production once allocated to American plants. Similarly, Mexico stands to benefit as it remains, despite the tariffs, a relatively cost-effective manufacturing hub for vehicles destined for markets outside the U.S. Emerging economies in Southeast Asia may also be considered for future investments, particularly as Stellantis seeks to hedge against any one nation becoming too politically volatile to host core operations. This strategic relocation is not without its challenges. Moving operations across borders involves not just financial costs, but logistical complexities and workforce reorganization. Yet Stellantis appears ready to bear these burdens in exchange for the long-term stability that more trade-friendly countries can offer. The company's decision underscores a harsh reality for the U.S. Protectionist trade policies, while intended to foster domestic industry, can inadvertently repel the very businesses they aim to support. Investors responded swiftly to the news. Markets dislike uncertainty, and the intersection of geopolitical policy and business operations has injected a level of unpredictability into the automotive sector that Wall Street finds deeply unsettling. Stellantis' stock took a hit as analysts began recalibrating their expectations for profitability and growth. There's now a broader concern that other U.S.-centric companies will encounter similar dilemmas, triggering a domino effect of cost-cutting, offshoring, and workforce reductions. Meanwhile, trade partners impacted by the tariffs are responding in kind. Countries affected by the U.S. measures have begun introducing counter-tariffs, often targeting politically sensitive sectors like agriculture and heavy machinery. This tit-for-tat escalation risks evolving into a full-scale trade war, further complicating the operating environment for multinational companies and threatening the stability of global supply chains. Automakers, which operate in an industry particularly exposed to global interdependence, are now rethinking the very logic of globalization. The assumption that goods and components could flow freely across borders is being tested. Companies are being forced to choose between operational efficiency and political resilience. In this new paradigm, supply chains are no longer optimized purely for cost and speed. They are being rebuilt with an eye toward geopolitical risk, redundancy, and regulatory insulation. The realignment of Stellantis' operations also raises questions about future investments in research and development. U.S.-based innovation centers, particularly those focusing on electric vehicles and autonomous driving technologies, may see funding diverted to facilities abroad. This would represent not just a financial shift, but a brain drain of technological talent. American universities, startups, and tech firms that had previously partnered with Stellantis, or hoped to do so, may find themselves cut off from vital corporate sponsorships and collaborations. The American auto industry as a whole stands at a crossroads. While Stellantis' departure may be the first major defection under the Trump tariff regime, it may not be the last. Other giants like Ford and General Motors, which have similarly globalized structures, are undoubtedly conducting internal reviews of their cost bases and trade exposure. The temptation to follow Stellantis' lead and reallocate production abroad will grow with every quarter that the tariffs remain in place. The geopolitical consequences are equally striking. For decades, the U.S. had served not just as a consumer market, but as a manufacturing magnet, a place where global firms wanted to build and sell. This reputational capital is now at risk. Countries that once courted U.S. companies may now be positioning themselves as alternatives, emphasizing stability, openness, and predictability in contrast to an increasingly protectionist America. The result is a slow but steady erosion of the U.S. quote, S stature as a central node in the global industrial network. Stellantis' withdrawal will also likely influence the strategic thinking of other industries beyond automotive. Aerospace, pharmaceuticals, electronics, and heavy equipment manufacturers are all watching closely. If one of the most integrated and globally sophisticated firms in the world concludes that the U.S. has become too volatile for sustained manufacturing, that verdict carries weight far beyond car assembly lines. It sets a precedent, shifts expectations, and alters boardroom calculations across sectors. The move to shut down U.S. factories and shift operations abroad also throws a spotlight on the precarious balance between government policy and private enterprise. While governments may act in pursuit of nationalist goals or political promises, companies operate under a different logic, one that values efficiency, cost predictability, and long-term market access. When those logics clash, As they have under the Trump administration's trade doctrine, the fallout can be immense and immediate. This scenario also challenges assumptions about economic patriotism. Multinational corporations are often expected to prioritize national loyalty in return for the benefits they receive from governments: tax breaks, infrastructure support, regulatory favors. Yet when political environments turn hostile to their business model, these companies can and will leave. In doing so, they reveal the limits of patriotic capitalism and the supremacy of global calculus in executive decision-making. For Stellantis, this departure from the U.S. is more than a temporary reaction. It represents a long-term strategic shift. The logistics of restarting shuttered plants, rehiring trained staff, and reintegrating supply chains are so complex that they make any return unlikely, at least in the short to medium term. Once the company commits to overseas production facilities and builds its distribution channels accordingly, the gravitational pull of those new operations will be hard to reverse. This episode also reframes the debate around trade policy itself. Supporters of the tariffs may argue that the pain is necessary to reshore manufacturing and reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. But Stellantis' move suggests that such goals may not be achievable through punitive measures alone. In the absence of comprehensive industrial policy, investment in infrastructure, innovation subsidies, workforce training, tariffs alone may serve only to repel investment rather than attract it. Carlos Tavares' announcement may have taken place in a corporate boardroom, but its reverberations are global. From assembly lines in Michigan to showrooms in Paris, from trade ministries in Mexico City to port terminals in Singapore, the implications of this shift are vast and ongoing. The interplay between politics and business has rarely been so raw or its consequences so far-reaching. As the dust begins to settle, one thing is clear: the age of global manufacturing, as it was previously understood, may be over. And Stellantis has just become the first major emblem of a new, more fragmented era. Would you like a summary version of this for easier sharing? The departure of Stellantis from the U.S. manufacturing landscape, driven by the newly imposed tariffs under President Donald Trump's administration, not only disrupts existing industrial equilibrium, but initiates a profound shift in how global automotive companies view their future strategies. Beyond the direct economic consequences, this pivotal moment carries significant strategic, political, and psychological reverberations for businesses, governments, workers, and global markets alike. One of the most consequential long-term effects is the restructuring of global investment flows. Traditionally, the United States has stood as a beacon for foreign direct investment due to its expansive consumer base, reliable legal system, relatively low regulatory hurdles, and skilled workforce. However, the unpredictability introduced by abrupt trade policy changes makes it less attractive. Corporations value consistency as much as profitability, and the perception that the U.S. may alter its trade rules at any political juncture is prompting a re-evaluation of where companies place their long-term capital. This recalibration is particularly significant when considering the scale and inertia of automotive manufacturing. Unlike sectors such as software or finance, which can be nimble and relocate relatively quickly, automotive production involves long-term infrastructure commitments. Factories cost billions to construct and maintain. Supply chains must be developed with precision. Once the decision is made to move, it becomes a semi-permanent shift. In choosing to pivot away from U.S. operations, Stellantis sends a strong message to both allies and competitors. Geopolitical uncertainty is a liability that corporations can no longer afford to ignore. The U.S. also faces a diminished role in shaping future industry standards as a result of this shift. For decades, American institutions and corporations helped drive global automotive regulations, safety standards, and innovation benchmarks. But as major players like Stellantis reduce their operational footprints, that influence starts to erode. Countries that host production facilities often gain leverage in setting environmental goals, safety protocols, and technology norms. A reduced American presence in the automotive supply chain means a diminished voice in the rules governing tomorrow's vehicles, from emissions thresholds to battery safety regulations. There's also an intellectual dimension to the problem. Many of the most important innovations in modern vehicle development, autonomous driving systems, electric propulsion platforms, battery chemistry, emerge from a tightly interconnected ecosystem of research institutions, suppliers, tech companies, and manufacturers. Stellantis' retreat from the US interrupts this ecosystem. American engineers, designers, and software developers who might have once collaborated directly with Stellantis teams may now find themselves disconnected from essential research initiatives and commercialization channels. This break in the chain slows innovation and diffuses talent across less synergistic networks. Labor implications are severe and extend well beyond the immediate job losses. The U.S. automotive labor force has, over the decades, adapted to shifts in production methods and embraced technological change. But the erosion of these jobs removes vital training grounds for skilled labor, especially in advanced manufacturing techniques. Future workers lose access to apprenticeships, technical programs, and on-the-job training pathways that only large-scale manufacturing environments can provide. This weakens the broader American workforce, limiting its future competitiveness in both the automotive and adjacent sectors like aerospace and green energy. Furthermore, the psychological toll on communities cannot be overstated. Industrial towns that anchored their identities to Stellantis plants now face economic uncertainty and cultural disruption. The closure of a factory doesn't merely represent the loss of jobs, it dismantles the entire social architecture of a region. Schools see declining enrollment, local businesses close, housing markets falter, and once stable families confront financial and emotional strain. These are long-term consequences that extend well beyond the economic ledger. Internationally, Stellantis' decision has catalyzed a fresh wave of regional competition. Governments and economic development agencies across Europe, Latin America, and Asia are actively courting corporations looking to relocate from the U.S. with offers of tax incentives, streamlined regulations, and infrastructural support. For many of these countries, attracting automotive production is not just about economic growth, it's a prestige project, a signal of their ascendancy in global commerce. The Stellantis exit has effectively sparked a new form of industrial diplomacy, where nations compete not only on the merits of cost and logistics, but on the promise of long-term political and regulatory stability. Within Stellantis itself, the move necessitates a complex internal reorganization. Shifting production means reassigning logistics pathways, renegotiating supplier contracts, and managing worker transitions across different legal and cultural environments. These are not trivial challenges, but for a company of Stellantis' scale and sophistication, they are manageable. What matters more is that the company is willing to incur these costs and embrace this complexity to escape an increasingly hostile American trade environment. That choice, made in the boardroom but felt across continents, underscores the extent to which geopolitical risk now dominates corporate planning. Financial markets will continue to digest the full implications of Stellantis' strategy shift. Credit rating agencies may reconsider how they assess U.S.-based operations, pricing in greater political and trade-related risk. Insurance providers will adjust premiums accordingly, and banks may reevaluate their lending criteria for industrial projects in the U.S., particularly in sectors exposed to international supply chains. This could lead to a tightening of capital availability, further depressing investment in American manufacturing and initiating a negative feedback loop where fewer companies build, fewer workers are employed, and local economies contract further. The departure also puts strain on the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Europe. Stellantis, with its Franco-Italian heritage, is deeply embedded in the European industrial tradition. European policymakers are now likely to view the U.S. as an increasingly unreliable economic partner, particularly under administrations inclined toward unilateral economic decisions. This affects more than just Stellantis. It shifts the broader trajectory of US-EU economic diplomacy. Joint projects on electric vehicle infrastructure, climate policy coordination, and technology standardization may now proceed without meaningful American involvement, reducing its influence in shaping the next wave of industrial transformation. Domestically, the political conversation around tariffs and protectionism is set to intensify. Supporters of the Trump administration's policy may continue to argue that short-term pain is justified by the promise of long-term domestic revival. But Stellantis' decision undermines that narrative by demonstrating that even large, integrated multinationals do not perceive a viable path to profitability under such conditions. If tariffs make the U.S. more expensive to operate in, and there are no compensating industrial policy tools to attract investment, then companies will simply leave. That outcome challenges the core premise of economic nationalism. that making things costlier for outsiders will make insiders stronger. Smaller automotive suppliers are particularly vulnerable in this environment. Stellantis' departure creates a cascading effect. Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers that depended on contracts from its U.S. factories may now face insolvency. These businesses often lack the resources to follow Stellantis abroad or shift their customer base quickly. The consolidation of the supplier base not only leads to job losses, but also limits competition and innovation in the industry as a whole. Additionally, the departure reduces the overall demand for local raw materials like steel and aluminum, further straining American resource industries already operating on tight margins. Environmental considerations are also at stake. Much of the recent progress in electric vehicle production has occurred under global collaboration between companies, regulators, and climate scientists. Stellantis' strategic repositioning means that new green factories will likely be built in countries more aligned with the company's long-term outlook. This means that American workers and communities may miss out on the jobs of the future, those tied to decarbonization, electrification, and clean energy mobility. The irony is that in attempting to preserve traditional industry through tariffs, the U.S. may end up ceding leadership in its transformation. Consumers, too, will feel the effects. Reduced domestic production, especially from a major player like Stellantis, limits competition in the marketplace. Over time, this could lead to higher prices for vehicles and fewer model choices, particularly in the mid-range market segments that Stellantis has traditionally dominated. Imported vehicles will carry the additional burden of tariffs, pushing prices even higher. This diminishes consumer purchasing power and may suppress overall demand, hurting the broader economy. Trade schools and universities, which often tailor programs to meet the needs of nearby employers, are caught in a difficult position. With Stellantis exiting, institutions that trained automotive engineers, mechanics, and assembly line workers must either pivot to new sectors or face declining enrollment. The loss of such partnerships also hinders academic research and the development of new technologies, as fewer opportunities exist for student co-ops, internships, and collaborative development projects. The logistics sector is another indirect casualty. Ports, rail lines, and trucking routes that were calibrated to serve the needs of Stellantis factories will now see diminished activity. Infrastructure investments justified by high volumes of industrial freight may no longer generate the expected returns. This adds stress to state and local budgets that planned around projected tax revenues from a now vanished industrial base. Moreover, this episode forces a reconsideration of the role of multilateral institutions in managing trade disputes. The tariffs introduced by the Trump administration bypassed many of the traditional checks provided by organizations like the World Trade Organization. Stellantis' strategic withdrawal shows what happens when major economies act unilaterally. Corporations recalibrate their loyalties not to nations, but to efficiency and survival. This could prompt renewed calls for strengthening international trade governance, though such reform is politically difficult in the current global climate. The defense industry may also be indirectly impacted. Automotive production capabilities often serve as a foundational element of national defense manufacturing capacity. Facilities that can be repurposed in times of conflict or emergency, such as during wartime or global pandemics, are a national asset. With Stellantis closing its American plants, a portion of that strategic flexibility disappears. The ability to scale up the production of vehicles, heavy machinery, or logistics equipment domestically in response to crisis situations becomes more limited. Beyond all tangible consequences lies a broader reputational issue for the United States. Once seen as the world's most welcoming environment for doing business, it now appears to many as a riskier bet. Stellantis, by choosing to move its investments elsewhere, signals to other multinational corporations that the rules of American commerce can shift rapidly and with little warning. That kind of volatility is antithetical to long-term investment planning. Companies planning billion-dollar projects will now think twice before committing to U.S.-based strategies, particularly in sectors sensitive to trade policy. The Stellantis case may also embolden other firms to adopt more assertive positions in the face of unfavorable regulation. Seeing that a multinational can make a dramatic exit and potentially still maintain profitability or even enhance it through relocation may encourage other CEOs to take similarly bold steps. This trend toward corporate autonomy, where business decisions challenge national policy in visible ways, redefines the balance of power between the state and private enterprise. It sets the stage for a more fragmented, multipolar global economy where allegiances are fluid and transactional. In this evolving world, nations will need to compete not just on tax rates or labor costs, but on clarity, consistency, and international cooperation. The Stellantis episode serves as a turning point in this recalibration. It's a bellwether, a clear demonstration that business no longer blindly follows national loyalty, but chases certainty, even if that means uprooting decades of investment. As other industries look on, the question now is not whether others will follow, but how quickly, and with what consequences. Would you like to continue this analysis with projections or case comparisons? The strategic exodus of Stellantis from the United States represents not merely a business realignment, but a tectonic upheaval in how economic power, industrial capability, and geopolitical leverage interact in the 21st century. As this multinational conglomerate shifts its operations away from American soil, the move initiates a recalibration of global production maps and labor flows, redefines industrial competitiveness, and magnifies emerging asymmetries between economically nationalistic and globally adaptive economies. The gravity of this realignment becomes more apparent when viewed through the lens of manufacturing ecosystems. Automotive production is rarely a self-contained operation. It exists within a lattice of secondary industries: tool and die makers, robotics integrators, chemical processors, IT systems developers, and specialized logistics providers. When a company like Stellantis uproots its US-based operations, the interdependent network built around its manufacturing base begins to wither. These smaller but essential entities rarely survive on diversified income streams. They're deeply tied to the fortunes of a few large clients. With Stellantis gone, the cascading economic impact will likely be far more extensive than any single metric, such as job losses at the factories might suggest. Furthermore, such a withdrawal fundamentally alters regional development strategies. Many U.S. states had bet heavily on automotive manufacturing as a pillar of their economic future. They had structured tax codes, educational programs, and infrastructure investment around the assumption that automotive companies would continue to anchor their industrial portfolios. These assumptions now appear outdated. Public-private partnerships built on these foundations lose their credibility. Future regional economic planning may have to pivot toward industries perceived as less vulnerable to geopolitical disruption, but this redirection could take decades to yield fruit, and there is no guarantee of success. Another dimension often overlooked in such scenarios is the role of corporate culture. Stellantis, like most multinational firms, has developed a distinct internal culture, one shaped by collaboration across national boundaries, agile management practices, and a global outlook on market dynamics. By shifting its operational locus away from the United States, that culture begins to realign as well. Talent acquisition strategies will change. The cultural DNA of the company's future workforce will lean more toward the norms of its new host nations. Over time, this cultural divergence reduces the influence of US-based leadership pipelines and shifts decision-making power to other regions, diluting America's soft power within the corporate sphere. The Stellantis departure also brings fresh urgency to the question of industrial sovereignty. For years, U.S. policymakers and think tanks have debated the strategic necessity of maintaining domestic production in key sectors, not just for economic reasons, but for national security and technological leadership. Automotive manufacturing, especially in the electric and autonomous sectors, intersects closely with national interests. From advanced battery chemistries to AI-enabled safety systems, the modern car increasingly resembles a mobile computing device. The U.S., by allowing such capacities to migrate abroad, risks creating a vacuum in sectors with dual-use implications, civilian and military alike. The shift also casts a spotlight on education policy. Vocational schools and universities that had aligned their curricula with automotive innovation, offering degrees and certifications in automotive engineering, EV systems, hybrid powertrains, and robotics, are suddenly out of sync with industrial demand. The intellectual capital of these programs becomes less deployable domestically, creating a misalignment between workforce training and job availability. Moreover, The incentive for top-tier students to pursue automotive-related careers within the U.S. may begin to wane, pushing the country toward a talent deficit in an industry that is critical to global mobility. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Stellantis shutting U.S. factories due to Trump's new tariffs? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.